how can you possibly have a hipster hobbit alliance that is sustainable?
It does seem to happen to Rory Stewart rather a lot, that his predictions turn out to be wrong.
What's really chilling is that the leaders of the United Arab Emirates worry that their own children will be radicalised by being educated not in Saudi Arabia, Pakistan or Afghanistan, but in London. Hello and welcome to Quite Right's Questions and Answers. I'm Michael Gove, editor of The Spectator.
And I'm Madeline Grant, assistant editor and parliamentary sketch writer of The Spectator.
And this week on our question and answer session, we'll be discussing Zach Polanski, Dominic Cummings, Rory Stewart and Jeremy Clarkson. Is that your idea of the perfect dinner party? Well, they're certainly the figures who are bewitching our minds.
Our first question comes from Gary Chambers. He asks, is the rise of the Green Party a genuine realignment in British politics or a passing protest vote? A blip on the left or a game changer?
I think it probably is a significant change. And it's a significant change that, funnily enough, reflects some of what we've seen happening in Europe. So in Europe, you've seen a sort of divide on the left between the traditional Social Democratic Party, whether that's the Socialists in France or the SPD in Germany, and then a more radical identity politics, urban young party, the Greens, of course, in Germany, and La France Insoumise, Mélenchon's party in France. And you can see that divide there, and you can see that quite a lot of the people who clustered around Jeremy Corbyn and Zara Sultana's Your Party have given up on it, moved towards the Greens. So a guy called Jamie Driscoll, who was the mayor of the North East, was actually quite a significant figure in the Labour Party. And then more recently, I think just in this last week, someone who had left the Labour Party, who'd been on its National Executive Committee, was a big Corbynite, who was involved with Your Party, has also moved there. So that's a sort of, if you can call it, elite thing. But grassroots, all the reporting is that in hipster London, in chilled Birmingham, and in student Bristol, the Greens are emphatically in the ascendant.
I think that Zach Polanski is commanding a kind of enthusiasm and, frankly, loyalty that Keir Starmer no longer does, or, frankly, rarely did. The numbers on this suggest that basically Labour's support keeps falling and falling and falling. And actually, even someone like Jeremy Corbyn, whose views were extreme for many voters, he still kept this rump of loyal supporters that would back him no matter what. I think the reason for that was that his views were not only what they agreed with, but there was an authenticity to him. There was something that he was offering that they felt they could trust. And I think Zach Polanski perhaps is commanding some of that now. It's not often talked about because I think that there were many on the soft left basically gave the impression that it was actually okay for Keir Starmer to U-turn on so much of his original manifesto because they were lying only to the left of the Labour Party, so who cares? That there has been some contempt shown to these people by the Labour Party itself, so no wonder they're interested in Zach Polanski. And actually, although I agree with very little of what he's promising, he does talk with authenticity, which is a very valued commodity in politics and very few politicians do have. Like, it's not my thing, but there is a market for it. I do think that it has a natural ceiling because Britain is not a radical left-wing country, but I think it will do well at the next council elections, and I think it will pick up seats at the next general election. It will do great harm to Keir Starmer for his U-turn that everyone said wasn't a big deal at the time.
Yeah, if you're a young or not so young idealist figure on the left, I mean, again, obviously not my politics, then the Green position, clear in your hostility towards Israel's actions in Palestine in a way that Labour is compromised. Your view on egalitarianism, clear about the need to tackle billionaires when Labour is, uncertain about its relationship with business, whether or not Labour is pro-business with certain caveats or more energetic in holding business to account. If you believe in a fundamentally transformed society, the Greens offer that. They offer the appeal that Corbyn had in 2017. And it's entirely understandable, as you say, with someone like Zach Polanski, who's a gifted communicator, that they should do well. And in past periods when Labour have been in power and there's been disaffection or disappointment on the left, that's led to growth within the Labour Party for change. But what we're now seeing is that there is an option, and because there have been a growing number of Green MPs and councillors, it's become an electorally viable option.
Yeah. This does create issues, though, because when you have more actual representatives, that means that there are more people actually having to come together and agree on something and being seen out and about in public and having their positions interrogated. You end up actually, I think the Green Party is quite a contradictory group. On the one hand, it picked up seats in these kind of well-heeled, leafy parts of the country. Sort of, there's that seat that they won in Herefordshire, which had previously been, was it Sir Bill Wiggins in...
Completely.
I can't remember exactly which seat, but it's the one that is now Ellie Chown's MP. But then at the local government level, some very insalubrious characters, people who are kind of borderline Islamists, have found a place within that party. And the fervour on Palestine explains a lot of their growing support. But on the other hand, they are getting these kind of leafy, affluent areas of the country too. I mean, I know people, including my own family, who are conservatives, probably small c conservatives, not the most politically active people, who voted Green because they say, well, I care about the bins, I care about my waterways. And they hear Green, and without perhaps interrogating it too closely, they go, well, we're all environmentalists here. We care very much about conservation. I wonder how long that can continue. As they start to gain more support. You actually have to, it's really hard to play off those two camps at the same time.
There is a contradiction. But I think that they can survive it for quite some time. The Lib Dems have for generations. So you're absolutely right. The two of the areas where the Greens have MPs, North Herefordshire and the Waveney Valley, which takes in Norfolk and Suffolk, it's hard to think of two places which are more England profonde. And the Waveney Valley is where in Trollope, the Longstaffs and the Carberries had their bucolic county retreats. North Herefordshire is real hobbit country.
Yes.
And you've got Green MPs there. Now, one of the reasons for that is that they have a very effectively weaponized arguments about the quality of our rivers and about the encroachment of ugly new housing. And so they become the party of the Crusties and the NIMBYs. And yet, at the same time, they also have an electoral presence in Bristol Central and in Brighton Pavilion, two arguably wokest constituencies in the country.
Yes.
You might think,
lots of students too.
Yes.
Yes.
How can you possibly have a hipster hobbit alliance that is sustainable? But actually, unless and until you're in power nationally, then it's great because for the hobbits, no disrespect, I'm very pro-hobbit myself, but if you are in that position, then you can be a virtuous NIMBY, as it were, because you can say no new development here. Oh, aren't you denying people the chance to get on the housing ladder? No, we just want to make sure that there's no wastewater in the beautiful Waveney or in the beautiful River Lug. No, we just want to make sure that this precious patch of unspoiled Aboriginal England isn't encroached upon. Are you on our side or do you want to see, a modern day Siaruman? Destroy the eldritch forests or the unspoilt rivers of this area? And you think, probably not.
Yeah.
Well, maybe vote for Green, vote for lovely Ellie Chown or delightful Adrian Ramsey.
Meanwhile in Brighton.
Yeah, exactly. So in that sense, you are absolutely right that there is a fundamental ideological cleavage, but in a tortuous metaphor, for some people this cleavage might be very attractive. Our next question comes from an anonymous listener, and they ask, what did you think to Rory Stewart's comments about Dominic Cummings? And do you agree with the Twitter pylon saying that he, Rory, is basically wrong about everything?
So to recap on this, what do we think about Rory Stewart's comments? Well, I think what he said was that Dominic Cummings had raised the point that in the UAE, the elites there are increasingly telling their children not to study in Britain because they fear that they will come back radicalised. And he made this point. Then Rory Stewart delivered a monologue in which he said that Cummings was a deranged lunatic and conspiracy theorist who was just making stuff up and was, always wrong about everything. Now it turns out that what Dominic Cummings was talking about is actually concrete policy favoured by the UAE, and it's been now written up in the news. So this was a bit of egg on face for Rory, and he said, I was wrong, Dominic Cummings, without doing, I would say, a very kind of profound apology. He said, you know what, you were right, I was wrong on this. It does seem to happen to Rory Stewart rather a lot that his predictions turn out to be wrong. And he, for example, predicted that Kamala Harris would win and was very confident about that. There were a lot of people that put money on Kamala Harris on the basis of what he said. I think to me, he's quite a recognisable figure. He's a figure, almost a tragic figure, who's kind of doomed to live at the passing of one age and find themselves clinging desperately to the orthodoxies that others have left behind. With his podcast with Alistair Campbell, you have, I think, by the way, Rory Stewart is worth $1 million of his podcast co-hosts and often has interesting and insightful things to say, but I would not say that about Campbell. But you have two men going through essentially a breakdown as they realise reality is not what they thought it was. It's kind of like sort of Waiting for Godot in podcast form. And the world has been very difficult. It's basically been torpedoed if you're someone that has a Rory or Alistair worldview. But it's becoming increasingly clear, I think, that the sort of sensibilism that they subscribe to is itself often wrong and itself often purveying conspiracy theories.
I can't approve on your analysis. But of course, in the best podcast spirit, I'll try. You're right. Rory does have significant talents. But I think that part of it is for a particular constituency that's felt disenfranchised by Brexit, Trump, populism, etc. There have been a number of figures who have been canonised, or at the very least beatified, because of their resistance to it. The people who've said, well, this wicked surge will end and we will be saved. And Rory is one of those. So Rory, by dint of making himself the anti-Boris in the Conservative 2019 leadership election, by dint of the sheer quality of his writing, he is a formidably brilliant writer.
His book is beautifully written.
Exactly.
It's a phenomenal book.
Has entirely understandably become venerated. But Rory, I'm sure, would be the first to acknowledge that, like all of us, he makes mistakes. And the critical thing about prophecy is that if you're a commentator and you're encouraged because people want to know what might happen and they want you to harness your wisdom, such as it is, to help them see through the paths to the future, the danger is that forecasts are undone, and the danger also is that having made a forecast, you want to interpret events in order to justify it, or you want to report on events in order to lead people towards that conclusion, which is why it is dangerous. I speak, of course, as the person who wrote a book called Michael Portillo, The Future of the Right. So I'm guilty of faux confidence in the past. The other thing is, it was Dominic Cummings himself who made the point that forecasting, political forecasting, was something about which you should be very wary.
Absolutely.
And he publicised the work of an academic called Philip Tetlock that pointed out that...
super forecasting.
Exactly.
Yes.
That so-called political experts are more likely to get things wrong than if you just throw darts at a board with different political outcomes attached to random outcomes.
This has been a real problem in other disciplines too. I mean, I think, for example, the economics profession, once it became in the business of making forecasts, began obviously not always meeting those forecasts. Has been very damaging to the reputation. Maybe the mistake is to attempt to try to forecast and to set so much store by your ability to predict the future rather than offer analysis on what we know for sure.
Yes,
maybe there's been an element of overextending by certain disciplines and commentators.
I think that's completely correct. I think the other thing also is Rory, I think, is enraged by Dom because, obviously, the Brexit wounds are still open. But again, I'm biased. I do not think that people should dismiss the points that Dom's made, even though they might appear to be, even though the arguments maybe seem to be made in bold and capital letters. People might think, what's this guy on about? He's been proven right.
Yes.
I'm not saying necessarily morally right, though I do agree with him. Proven right time after time after time. And I would set Dom Cummings, not so much predictions, but analyses of currents against anyone else in this country. And I think that, of course, Rory felt that Dom had overstepped the mark here. But Dom's point was, as you quite rightly point out, vindicated. And that in itself is important because we should look at the underlying story as well. We as a country should look at the underlying story. It may be amusing to note that Rory has to correct himself. It may be interesting that it was Dominic Cummings who knew more about what was happening in the United Arab Emirates than a former Foreign Office minister. Mm-hmm. But what's really chilling is that the leaders of the United Arab Emirates worry that their own children will be radicalised by being educated not in Saudi Arabia, Pakistan or Afghanistan, but in London.
Yeah. Well, I think there's two things going on here. I completely agree with what you say about Islamism, of course. I think there's firstly the well-documented phenomenon. There is a meme that actually Rory Stewart isn't clever, and I disagree with that. I think he's highly intelligent. But historically, it's a well-documented phenomenon that clever people are actually more likely to buy into terrible ideas or convince themselves of things they're untrue. This perhaps has something to do with the fact that clever people are quite good at justifying ideas to themselves and to other people, which takes a certain skill to defend. A less clever person wouldn't be able to pass it either to other people or to themselves. Does that make sense? So there's that phenomenon, which I think Rory Stewart may be part of. There's also, I think, the reason that Cummings his analysis was of higher quality, I think comes from the fact in part that he is a historian, whereas Rory Stewart began studying history, interestingly, at university, but switched to PPE, the classic wide-ranging but can be shallow analysis. Not true in all cases, but I do think it's interesting also that a historian may take a longer view of human history in which you see not necessarily events repeating themselves, but events rhyming with each other and human nature remaining as flawed as it always is. And so I think that partly explains why I would take the Cummings analysis, but also there was that clip from the American election podcast that The Rest Is Family put out, in which they had a range of analysts, including Rory Stewart, Alistair Campbell. They also had the historian Dominic Sandbrook. And it's so interesting when they're going around the table and asking everyone to predict what happens. The only person who correctly predicts that Donald Trump will win is Dominic Sandbrook. And that may be that a historian takes a dimmer view. I also wonder if you're someone of the kind of liberal progressive attitude that Rory Stewart is, that you kind of view history as an arc of progress. Things naturally get better. The idea of even countenancing a Trump victory was too difficult. So then a kind of motivated reasoning takes hold and you say the thing that you want to happen will happen.
Yes, I cleave to the view that PPE is not a degree. It's simply 3 A-levels that people happen to take between the ages of 18 and 21, and that history is a proper degree. But more to the point, all flippancy, though rooted flippancy aside, you're correct that if you look, for example, at some of the current debates about Trump and America, they show an ahistorical understanding of how America has operated in the past. That's not to excuse Trump or to justify Trump, but the political systems of the world, and as you quite correctly point out, the actions of individuals are better understood by reference to human nature and the constraints of power as they've been exercised over time. And similarly, if we're considering the challenge, the original question about whether or not this country is a safe space for young men and women from the UAE to be educated in. The broader question about the purpose of universities and how you preserve free inquiry and how you deal with extremism, these questions have been discussed and debated in the past, and we can learn from that reservoir of knowledge as easily as we can from anything else.
There's two lines that I always think of in relation to it. The first is Lear's fool, what he says in King Lear. The fool doth think he's wise, but the wise man knows himself to be a fool. Sometimes the cleverest thing is to have, I guess, a bit more humility. There's also a bit in Harry Potter, to go from highbrow to lowbrow, where Dumbledore says to Harry, because I am clever, it's precise, my mistakes are of correspondingly greater magnitude. So in a way, there is a sense of being perhaps in a small way, the victim of your own success. But I do want to say, Rory Stewart, firstly, fair play to him for acknowledging his mistakes, because many people just make crappy pronouncements and never once reflect on how they got there or what they said. And also fair play to them for having a lot more views than our podcast does.
At the moment.
Final question is from Ron Garrett. Why are Labour going after our pubs?
Well, I find it difficult to understand why any political party would be so inept as to slap taxes on pubs and at the same time, in pursuit of a crusade against drink driving and in favour of road safety, also interfere with the alcohol limits on driving. Because the two together make it look as though there's an assault on the pub. And it was the case that months ago, the idea was floated of further restrictions on smoking outside in pubs and pub gardens. And West Streeting, I think it was shrewd enough to recognise that this was one step too far. And I think it's just...
Good thing the Tories were always so good on these things.
Yeah. I think it's just ineptitude, though, I'm probably a Regius professor of ineptitude. But I don't know, Maddie, do you think that there is some latent Cromwellianism in this?
There's definitely that. And when the Labour Party are short of ideas and want to distract from failures elsewhere, they often go for some new petty restriction, partly because they lack the competence and the ambition to find something better to do. So they're like, well, we'll pull that lever, let's have a new road strategy in which we probably have some things that are sensible in there, but we also make life needlessly more difficult, and we don't consider the unintended consequences on particularly rural businesses, rural pubs who are going to be having a really hard time if essentially even having one drink before driving has been outlawed. It showed the Minister, Lillian Greenwood, when she was on TV talking about this, showed a completely tin-eared lack of knowledge about what day-to-day life is like in the countryside. She was saying, take public transport. And a lot of people living in rural areas would say, chance would be a fine thing. Or take a taxi, how much is that going to cost? Or can I even get a taxi? So there is that element, but I think it comes from needing to look busy and distract. So they do what is in their gift, which is petty authoritarianism. But I do think that the general cack-handedness of the business rate policy, which has been partially U-turned on, but I don't think this is the end of the story, because firstly, it only applies to pubs. It doesn't apply to restaurants, cafes, hotels. Other forms of hospitality are also suffering hugely. And the business rates have multiplied so much because of how they were calculated. The fact that they didn't see this coming shows a lack of business acumen as well. Or perhaps an inability to listen to the industry, because there were prominent figures who were complaining about this for weeks and months. And I think it reached a crescendo and eventually they U-turned, but it was probably visible from outer space. The fact that there was such a terrible mistake had gone into the budget suggests to me that they are inexperienced. They're going by wonky spreadsheets and maybe not spending enough time talking to actual people that are trying in a very difficult environment to keep their businesses afloat. And I don't think it's the end, because all this stuff applies to the other forms of hospitality too.
I think that in their anxiety, the government's anxiety, to try to make the numbers add up, the spreadsheet socialism that you mentioned, they looked at the generous business rate exemptions that had been put in place because of COVID and the huge hit that the hospitality sector took. And they thought, well, these are past their sell-by date, let's call them back. We're only going back to the situation beforehand. This is not an attack. It's the removal of a relief that is no longer justified. But if they were talking regularly to those in the hospitality sector, horrible phrase, if they were talking regularly to people who run pubs, they would have known that national insurance increases and that employment rights legislation were making life very difficult. And they would have known that this tax change would have been another blow. And the drink driving indication would also have been another, I think, more symbolic, but still real sort of push against the pub culture. And so it was inevitably going to produce a backlash. What makes it, well, I don't think odder, but what makes it incongruous is that of all of the pub goers in Parliament, the Prime Minister is one of the most, how can I put it, energetic.
Yeah, which is kind of, I think, not enough known about him.
No.
I think it would, I don't know, the trouble is that if you lean into it, even if you enjoy pubs, if you lean into it in a kind of faux laddish way, it will also come across as inauthentic. And I sort of feel a bit sorry for the Prime Minister in that he's actually genuinely a massive fan of football. But whenever he talks about football, I always think he sounds like some kind of Martian who's attempting to ingratiate himself with other football fans.
No, it's true that if one were to reflect on the Prime Minister's extracurricular life, pubs, football, playing, watching, he is thoroughly in the mainstream of laddish life, but the impression that he gives, and certainly the policies that the government generates, suggests that any Merrie England spirit is there to be crushed. And I think, again, the contrast with Rachel Reeves doesn't work to the government's advantage, or rather the perception of Rachel Reeves doesn't work to the government advantage, because when, in response to the removal of this support, publicans said Labour MPs were barred, and in her own constituency, someone said, Rachel Reeves is now banned from my pub. It's her favourite local. I thought, I can't imagine, I may be doing her a grave disservice, I can't imagine Rachel heading down on a Friday night for a baby Guinness and a pint of Maddie. It didn't seem to me that was her natural milieu, but the determination on the part of so many publicans to bar Labour MPs clearly stung and hit home. And of course, Kemi Badenoch was quite quick off the mark because she, in alliance with, I think, the Daily Telegraph, launched a campaign to save our pub. And it was the case that just 24 hours later, we had the U-turn.
Well, I think the year when there were the most pub closures in recent history was 2017. So there was a year when Tories were in charge. So
yes.
I'm not sure that the Tories always have the best leg to stand on, but there's no denying that there is something special about pubs. And I think that explains why the government decided to U-turn on that bit, but not the other hospitality venues that are also under attack. There is something about the Great British Tavern. I think it was Hilaire Belloc who said, when you have lost your inns, drown your empty cells, for you will have lost the last of England. This sentiment is, I think, quite broadly shared.
Yes,
and they know this. And then you've got very influential and public-facing publicans like Jeremy Clarkson being the most prominent, but also the chef Tom Kerridge, who was actually one of the business owners who signed a letter calling for the Labour government to come into power. You have him on various programmes and LBC and late night TV complaining about government policy. It's harder to maintain. It's funny, I think Jeremy Clarkson across a range of areas is the sort of the embodiment of Merrie England pitched against the dour Puritans that we now have in charge.
I think that Jeremy Clarkson might be able to lay claim to the fact that over both the farmers' tax and the pub tax, he's driven two U-turns, which have been significant blows to this government's prestige. And in that sense, yes, he is a sort of modern-day Hereward the Wake.